Okay, so here you see a figure and a photograph of the human brain. Okay, so we're going to learn some of the important parts and functions of the different areas of the brain. But before we begin, we have to take a look at the structures that surround and protect the brain. Okay, so let's flip through some of these pages, and let me just go to a different page very quickly. Here on figure 14.5 in your textbook, okay, you have a figure here that shows you some of the various structures that surround and also protect the brain. So we've learned about the bones of the skull, so that won't be asked on the final, the names of the bones of the skull, but it is something that we've already learned about, such as the parietal bones, the frontal bone, etc., etc. So the bones of the skull provide most of the protection of your brain. Okay. However, underneath the bones of your skull, surrounding your brain, we have these connective tissue membranes. The connective tissue membranes are called the meninges. So let's take a look at these meninges. Okay, let me type that down for you. Okay, so the meninges. Now, these are connective tissue membranes, okay, the meninges, and they actually arranged into 3 layers. So let's look at the 3 layers of the meninges. Now, these same 3 layers are arranged in the same order around the spinal cord as well. Therefore, the meninges surround all parts of the central nervous system. So keeping that in mind, you probably now have a good idea of these 3 layers. So let's take a look at the figure here. Now, first we have the outermost layer. The outermost layer, which you see right here, which comes in contact with the bones of the skull. So this is the outermost layer, the outermost meningeal layer. Now, in the diagram, you see that it is split. It is split into 2 parts. You don't have to worry about both parts, but just this whole layer, which is very thick, resistant, and tough, is called the dura mater. So let me underline that word for you. Okay, the dura mater. Okay, so that is one of the meningeal layers. Now, next, the dura mater again is the outermost layer. But next, the middle layer. That middle layer, which has the appearance of spider webs. Okay, you can see right here from the figure. Let me show you my hand. You see right underneath this layer that it has these very fine little fibers, okay, that makes it look almost like the appearance of spider webs. Okay, so that layer has been named after that appearance, and it's called the arachnoid matter. The arachnoid matter. Okay, so that's the middle layer. Okay, and then lastly we have our deepest layer. And our deepest layer is the one that attaches tightly to the surface, directly onto the surface of your brain. Not only that, but also directly onto the surface of the spinal cord. So here, if we look carefully, okay, if you look carefully, you can see that that layer is also called, like it is in the spinal cord, it's called the pia mater. So let me underline that word. Pia mater, okay? Yes, so these 3 layers have the same name here in the brain as in the spinal cord and are arranged in the same order here as they are in the spinal cord. Okay, so these 3 layers, besides surrounding the brain surface, they provide some protection and so forth, okay? All right, good. Any other questions about the 3 meningeal layers or the meninges? Okay, so let's go back to the figure there of the brain, the initial figure. Okay, and now when we look at the brain, okay, so here's a figure and a photograph. You see that its outer surface looks bumpy and wrinkled. But if we cut open the brain, we dissect the brain, we would find inside these spaces or cavities. Let's take a look at another figure, figure 14.6. So here on figure 14.6, you can see and appreciate these spaces or cavities that we have inside the brain. So you can see with the photograph down here, these sort of hollow spaces. Some of the spaces contain structures like the structures of the diencephalon. Okay, other spaces are more hollow. Okay, but here on the upper diagram of this figure, you see the spaces and these cavities highlighted in light blue color. Now, these cavities, spaces, and channels, okay, some of these are cavities, but then we also have channels that connect, that communicate these cavities, which we'll talk about in a moment. But cavities, spaces, channels are not actually structures. They're more of just hollow areas or spaces. So how can we represent a structure that is hollow? Well, we can best represent it by using some colors. And here you can see with these shaded blue areas, these highlighted blue areas represent these cavities and spaces. Now, why did they choose the color blue rather than purple or red or green? I think they chose the color blue because these spaces contain something very important. Any idea what the spaces contain? Anyone know? We did mention it in lab class. So if you remember, you can type it down. The cavities or spaces here in the brain contain CSF, correct. CSF, which stands for cerebral spinal fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid. So meaning that this fluid also goes into your spinal cord. And you can see right here, the fluid then continues to flow downward through the central canal of the spinal cord. And it will go down through the whole length of the spinal cord. So this fluid is actually within the cavities and spaces there, the channels that are in your central nervous system. Okay, so that is a good figure here to use as reference so that when we identify and label these different spaces. Okay, but now we want to take a look at, first of all, before we look at the spaces, the purpose of the cerebral spinal fluid. So with another figure, I will come back to this figure, but I want to show you with another figure right here. You can see how the fluid is produced by different cells that we find within the brain. Okay, a group of cells also produces a large amount of this cerebral spinal fluid, a group of cells that you learned already about when we discussed the different cells of the central nervous system, right? The cells that we refer to as the ependymal cells. Okay, so that may ring a bell. The ependymal cells, which line the cavities. So, and then a few other things. But this fluid that is formed then has to flow. It can't just be stable and just hang there. It has to flow and circulate. So here you can see with this figure, figure 14.7, how the fluid flows and circulates. It begins up here where you have number 1 through one of the cavities. Then it goes through this tiny space here and into the next cavity here, and then downward through another cavity, and then down into the spinal cord central canal. Okay, some of the fluid will also flow through escape holes. This little escape hole that you see here called aperture, some of that fluid will escape out that way through that aperture. Aperture means opening, and flow outside of the brain surface and flow like this on the outer surface of the brain. Okay, so your brain is also going to be surrounded and covered by this cerebral spinal fluid. So now that you've seen how this fluid flows and where you find the fluid, not only in the brain, but surrounding the brain as well, as you see up here, okay, that gives us a better sense of the purpose of this fluid. So what would you say one purpose of this fluid is? Protection. Good. Protection. Good. And how does it provide protection? Well, one way that it provides protection is because it surrounds your brain like this, right? It allows and gives buoyancy. Let me type that word down for you. So this CSF provides buoyancy. Some persons this word buoyancy, others pronounce it buoyancy. Regardless of that, the word buoy or buoy is a thing that you see in the oceans. It's a thing that sailors and captains of ships will find, especially near harbors before they reach the city. They'll find these things called buoys. So, therefore, understanding what the buoys are doing in the ocean, what does buoyancy mean? Yes, correct. It means to float, to float. Okay, so buoyancy means to float. And this is sort of what your brain is doing. Your brain is sort of floating. This is the brain. It's sort of floating there within your skull, and it's floating there inside of this fluid called the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, does that provide any purpose? Of course, it protects your brain. If you didn't have this fluid, every time that you hit your head or you jump or you move your head too quickly, your head would hit the bones of your skull, too hard, and it could cause trauma, pain, and so forth. So the fluid that you have there surrounding the brain, this cerebral spinal fluid, protects it by providing buoyancy. Now, another thing that the fluid does, so again, going back to the cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so let me review that. Okay. Besides protection and buoyancy, is that this cerebral spinal fluid also does maintain chemical stability. It maintains chemical stability, right? Since this fluid, which is in your brain, flows and it circulates within your brain, it's going to help provide nutrients and solutes, but also remove wastes. Okay, so besides providing and removing wastes, okay, that will all help to maintain some chemical regulation, some chemical stability. Okay, so what happens if the fluid builds up in the brain? Well, that can happen, okay, and it can build up, surround the brain, and if that occurs, it would produce pressure on the brain, cause headaches, cause some various brain dysfunctions, and could be lethal as well. Okay, so there are cases, medical cases, where the brain can swell for different reasons. Okay, uh, is very common with children who suffer from some type of brain infection or meningitis. Okay, and that fluid buildup can be very aggressive and cause death. Okay, so yes, that is a few important things here about the cerebral spinal fluid. Now, going back to the circulation and the flow of the cerebral spinal fluid, the cerebral spinal fluid, as you see from this diagram, okay, will flow in a certain way. So it begins up here, then it flows down through here, through the brainstem, and down into the spinal cord. Okay, but does the brain have a pump like the cardiovascular system does? Does the brain have a pump like your heart for the cardiovascular system? Anybody know? Yes, correct, correct. It does not have a pump. So then my next question is, then how does this fluid flow? How does it circulate? What allows the fluid to circulate through these cavities and passageways? You might have to go back to your notes or remember when we discussed the different neuroglial cells, and specifically the neuroglial cells of the central nervous system. Okay, now there was a cell group there that had cilia, right? Cilia that allowed this fluid to flow and circulate. What cell group was that had cilia and allowed the fluid to flow within the brain cavities? Anyone remember what cell group that was? It was one of the neuroglia of the central nervous system. Okay, guys, so it's going to be necessary that you review the neuroglial cells of the nervous system, and that was the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells, okay? The same cells that produce the fluid, right? So much of the fluid is produced by the ependymal cells, and those cells have cilia, which then allow the fluid to circulate like this, okay? So, a few important things there about those cells, okay? So how does the fluid flow now? Well, the fluid begins to flow, and it starts up here from these two cavities up here, deep in the cerebral hemispheres. Now, here's one of the cerebral hemispheres, okay? And then the other cerebral hemisphere will be on the other half of the brain, okay? So if we look at a figure like this, we can appreciate the two cerebral hemispheres. And inside the cerebral hemispheres, we have there, as you see right here, lateral ventricles. Also highlighted in the diagram above, the lateral ventricles. They kind of look like this shape, sort of bulb or balloon shaped area, okay, like two deflated balloons. And here you can see, okay, so those are the lateral ventricles. So let's go back to now my figure that follows the pathway that the cerebral spinal fluid flows. So it begins there at the lateral ventricles. You do have here listed as well the pathway that it follows. However, this may have more than you need to know. So I'll go over just the basic parts. So lateral ventricles. Now from there, the fluid then communicates through a tiny little opening here, a foramen. The fluid goes through a tiny hole, a foramen here. It's called interventricular foramen, which is listed here in the diagram as well. Okay, so from lateral ventricles, then the fluid flows through the interventricular foramen, which is right about where you have number 2 here. Then from there, the fluid then goes right through that small hole and into this space here. This space that we have where it says number 3, called the third ventricle. The third ventricle. Okay, so it enters now into this cavity here, the third ventricle. This whole area here. Now the third ventricle is actually occupied and it shelters the parts of the diencephalon. So we'll talk about the parts of the diencephalon later on. However, the diencephalon is within this space called the third ventricle. So again, these cavities, these ventricles and these passageways are just spaces, okay? But some of these spaces, besides being filled with cerebral spinal fluid, some of these spaces are also going to contain structures like the structures of the diencephalon in the third ventricle. Now the fluid flows through the third ventricle and it goes down through this narrow channel that you have here. This narrow channel. Now we did say in lab the name of that narrow channel. If you remember, we said it was the aqueduct of the cerebrum, right? The aqueduct, right? The cerebral aqueduct, which I'm going to underline. So number 4 here on this figure would be the cerebral aqueduct. So the fluid flows through this very narrow channel, which is going right through part of the brainstem. Okay, all of this here is your brainstem, which we'll also review in a moment. However, the fluid then flows to the cerebral aqueduct, which then communicates into the fourth ventricle right here. Your fourth ventricle. So let me underline that. Okay, and now the fluid enters into the fourth ventricle. Okay, from the fourth ventricle, the fluid can either escape through this tiny little hole there called an aperture. Okay, aperture. Or what other path can the fluid take besides going out through the tiny escape hole? What other path could it take? It could go just simply where? Down into the central canal. Very good. So let me draw with an arrow here. The fluid can just flow simply down and continue down this way into the central canal that you see right here of the spinal cord. Okay, good. So those are the that is the structures here that contain cerebrospinal fluid, and then the pathway that the fluid flows. Okay, and there's a lot of things here on this diagram that I'm not going to ask about, but these would be the major cavities and structures that communicate these cavities, such as the cerebral aqueduct that contain this cerebral spinal fluid. All right, so what I want to move on to, though, is go back to this figure again, the figure that showed us the meninges. Now, if you look at the meninges, okay, we saw that it surrounds the brain, okay? And now here with this figure, we see that we take a section of the brain and we cut a portion of the brain and expose it. Okay, so here's a section of the brain cut and exposed. Okay, now if we look at the section of the brain here, looks like it's somewhere near the middle of the brain, around the parietal frontal area. Okay, but anyway, if we cut it that way, this would be a nice way to cut it. You would be able to appreciate that it has two shaded areas. Okay, so here's the brain and the brain tissue, and you have two shaded areas. So let's look at these two areas. Okay, first we have the gray matter, right? This outer portion here, almost like the outer layer of the brain, is darker in color, and we refer to it as what you see right here, known as the gray matter. Now, the reason why it has that sort of darker color and why it's called gray matter is because of the same reason that it was gray matter in the spinal cord. And that's because it contains mainly neuron bodies, right? Neuron bodies. Also, you might find plenty of dendrites, okay, as well, and not many, but some unmyelinated axons. So that's in the gray matter. But mostly it's made up of the neuron bodies, and that's what gives it that darker color appearance. Okay. Now the gray matter in the brain is located here. Is located within this outer section of the brain. Okay. That outer section of the brain where we have gray matter, almost like an outer layer, is referred to more specifically as, let me use a line here, as a point right there. Does anyone have an idea what it's called? Well, first of all, we'll start with the word cerebral. Cerebral meaning the brain. But cerebral what? In many organs of the body, that outer portion, that outer section or layer of a tissue, of an organ, is often referred to as a what? A cerebral, okay, so let me write it down then. Cerebral cortex. Okay, so the gray matter in the brain is found here within the cerebral cortex. This would be your cerebral cortex. Now, the deeper portion, deeper, would be here. Would be where we find our white matter. Okay, what makes this brain tissue area white? What gives it that lighter color appearance? And the reason why we call it white matter is because it consists of myelinated axons. Very good. So axons that are mainly going to be myelinated. In fact, most axons of the nervous system have myelin. Okay, so that's what gives it that whiter color appearance. And it also looks sort of fibrous. I don't think you can appreciate that so well here with the figure, but it would look sort of like stringy and fibrous with lots of lines because of the axons. Okay, so those are the two parts there, the two areas, right, known as matter of the brain. Now, in the spinal cord, remember, this organization of gray matter versus white matter was reversed in the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the gray matter was deeper underneath the white matter. Okay, so that we saw with the spinal cord last week. All right, so what I want to continue with, though, now is take a look at the parts of the brain. Now, the brain is fascinating, but it is fascinating and it's so interesting because it has so many different functions and it has so many different areas, and each area has a specific function. Each structure has not only one, but many specific functions as well. So let's dissect the brain and take a closer look. Uh, you can use this figure to initially understand a few things. Okay, so we'll look at some initial things and then we'll move on to another figure to see more detail. Okay. Okay, so let me go back to this figure 14.1 again. And what you have right here is, if you look on the surface of the brain, whether it's with a figure or with a photograph, whether it's a sheep's brain, a cat's brain, or any mammal's brain, you'll see that on the surface, right? On the surface, you have these bumps. Now, the bumps are found on both halves. Each half of the brain is called the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, we'll look at also some differences between both cerebral hemispheres. Okay, but you can see right away that they look almost identical, but there are some functional differences that we'll see. Okay, so each of these halves in the brain of the cerebrum, right? The cerebrum are called the cerebral hemispheres. So let's focus now on the cerebrum. Okay, so that's the first thing, the hemispheres. Now, on the outer surface, you now take a look at each of the hemispheres and you see these bumps, these elevated ridges, okay? These sort of finger-like type of shapes, okay? Well, what we call those, they're generally called gyri, which you see right here on the figure. Gyri. Gyri is the plural form of gyrus. So the word gyrus is just one. Gyri means many. So that's why you see the word gyri here, because you have many of them throughout the surface of the cerebrum. Okay, so we're looking at the cerebrum first. So this is one major part of the brain, the cerebrum. Okay, now the gyri, though, in between these gyri, you see some lines, these shallow grooves throughout the surface there. All those little lines that you see there. Okay, the lines, which you can also appreciate here with the photograph, these shallow grooves throughout the surface there, in between the gyri. Those shallow grooves here on the surface of the cerebrum are called sulci. Okay, now some of the sulci are specific and special. So let's take a look at some of these sulci. The word sulci is plural for sulcus. Okay, so let's now look at some of the important sulci. For instance, this one right here, the central sulcus. Okay, so that's the central sulcus right here. That line, which you see that comes right down from the top to the middle, around there, that's called your central sulcus. Do we have the central sulcus on this figure? Of course, that would be the central sulcus. Now, in fact, let me use a colorful diagram to show you the central sulcus and what it does. So here, turn into this next figure, figure 1413. Okay, you can see right there the central sulcus as well. Okay, so that's one of the important shallow grooves. Okay, one of the important sulci. Now, what that groove does, what that central sulcus does, is that it separates the cerebrum into two of the important lobes. Okay, the central sulcus separates the cerebrum into two of the important lobes. What are this lobe and this other lobe called? The blue and the purple lobe. What are they called? You just have to look at the figure. It's the frontal and the parietal lobe. Very good. So that central sulcus separates the frontal from the parietal lobe. So one important thing that sulcus does is that it serves as a marking, as a separation, or as a line that separates and gives you indication of my frontal lobe, which is all of this area shaded in different colors of blue, versus this other area shaded in different colors of purple. Okay, so this is that figure that you can appreciate that sulcus. Okay, all right, let's look at the other sulci though. So that was first the central sulcus. But going back to my first figure there, figure 14.1. Let's look at another important sulcus. The next important sulcus is this one right here. Okay, this line, and it ends somewhere about there. It might even go a little higher, but here on the bottom diagram you can see that line as well. It's not labeled here, however, let me use a marker to show you the line. Okay, so here I'm going to draw and just paint that line in. Okay, so what I drew there in red is my lateral sulcus, the lateral sulcus, which is labeled on the view above. Okay, so what does that sulcus do? It actually separates one important lobe from two lobes that are above it. Now we go back to my colorful diagram here, and you can see right here that lateral sulcus. Okay, this is the lateral sulcus. Now if you look at the lateral sulcus separates this lobe, the temporal lobe, from the two superior lobes above. It separates the temporal lobe from these two lobes that are above it, the frontal and parietal lobes. So that lateral sulcus will actually separate the temporal lobe from the other lobes above. Okay, now we'll get to this part here in a moment, to what happens if we pull apart the lateral sulcus. But let's go back to now my figure 14.1 again and look at the other important sulcus here. And right here we have one other important sulcus here in the back. Let me draw with a marker. Okay, right about here. Okay, and on the photograph, is it labeled there? No, but that sulcus that we have there would be somewhere about here, I would say. Okay, if you look at it, what is it sort of separating? What is it separating? It separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Very good. It separates the occipital lobe, which is this lobe right here at the back, from the parietal lobe, which is above it or anterior to it. Okay, now let's go back to my figure with the colored diagram. And this is the best place to see that parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, so that, let me shade that in with a red marker. This is the parieto-occipital sulcus. Okay, parieto-occipital, and that one is actually named right after what it's doing, separating the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Okay, so these different sulci, okay, these few important sulci that I mentioned are important ones that actually separate your brain into lobes, separate your brain into these different lobes. Okay, so we have the frontal lobe, a parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital. However, there is one fifth lobe that we'll take a look at also. And if we take instruments like this, if you were able to do a dissection, whether it was a sheep's brain dissection or whatever, and you separate, you stick it right into the lateral sulcus here, and you separate the lateral sulcus like this, you would find deep inside one other lobe. Okay, that one other lobe that you see right there, known as the insula or insular lobe. Okay, insula or insular lobe. Okay, so that lobe you would only see if you would separate it this way. Okay, now does that lobe have any important role? It does. We haven't looked at the functions of these lobes yet, but we'll take a look at that very soon. Okay, but let's go back to some other important markings on the cerebrum. So going back to one of my earlier diagrams again. Okay, this is a good diagram. It has a lot of anatomy here. Let's look at some other important structures and and so forth, markings on the surface of the cerebrum. Now, on the cerebrum, you have this deep, wide space here, or groove, this deep, wide space that you see in the middle. That is called the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is actually what separates, okay, so let me underline that, is actually what separates the two cerebral hemispheres from each other. Okay, so when we were going to do the dissection, we were actually going to cut and separate it right here within the middle of the brain through that longitudinal fissure. So the fissures are just deeper and wider spaces or grooves, okay? And this is one of the important fissures, the longitudinal fissure. Now, there is another fissure, though. Let me point that here with the figure. And that's this fissure that you see right there. You see a line there that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum, a space or a groove, okay? That one is called the transverse fissure. The transverse fissure because of its location. Okay, it's on the side here, on the side separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Okay, and in the dissection, we would have actually saw this space as being very wide, and it actually falls right apart. When there's no meninges, the brain starts coming apart, and this transverse fissure opens up very widely and quickly, and the cerebellum almost just dangles off of the rest of the brain. Okay. However, here you can appreciate also the transverse fissure as well. So that fissure separates cerebellum from cerebrum. So those are some of the important fissures as well. Okay. So sulci are the shallow grooves that you have throughout the surface here, those different lines, whereas the fissures, like this big one here, or that one that we just mentioned, are deeper, wider grooves or spaces. Okay, so let's take a look at now the figure for the parts of the brain here with color. Okay, and going back to this figure, this is a wonderful figure, figure 1413, because I like that it has it all colored in. And want to take a look now at the functional structures of the brain. So as we describe these functional structures, we will now also describe the roles that are associated with the different areas. Okay, so let's take a look first at this large lobe here in the anterior portion of your cerebrum. And this large lobe, we said, was called the frontal lobe. Okay, so this whole portion that's colored in different shades of blue, including the dark blue area and the light blue area, is part of your frontal lobe. So we're looking at frontal lobe first. All right, so if you look at the frontal lobe, one important thing that we have here in the frontal lobe, one important area, is this gyrus here. Now remember, the gyri are like these finger-shaped structures, these ridges or elevations that we have on the surface of the cerebrum. So this is one of the gyri that we will learn about. Okay, most of the other gyri we will not worry so much about, but this one we will take a quick look at and understand its functions. Okay, this gyrus here, which is just anterior to this groove, right? The groove we said there was called the central sulcus. So the gyrus that we have right anterior to it is named, because of its location, as the precentral gyrus. Okay, so anterior to the central sulcus we have the precentral gyrus. Now, what is so important about this precentral gyrus? Let me show you with another figure, if possible, in this diagram, in this chapter. And yes, going quickly to this figure, figure 1421. I think this might be one of the figures shows us that role. Okay, going back to figure 1421. You see right here the precentral gyrus, which is just anterior to the central sulcus. Okay. Now, if you look at the diagram here, it's showing you that it provides movement of different body parts, right? Movement of body parts, all right? All the different body parts throughout your body, right? Such as your arms and your fingers, your mouth, tongue, feet, and so forth. Okay? So the precentral gyrus' main role is to provide movement. So because of that, now I'll go back to my colorful diagram here. This one instead, 1420, okay, because it has more functional areas. The precentral gyrus, which was this one here, is your primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex, some books will just simply call it the primary motor area. So there in that gyrus, we find this important role. It is the primary motor area, which allows you to have movement of body parts, right? Movement of your body parts, such as movement of your arms and your legs, your tongue, your mouth, your lips, and so on and so on. So primary motor cortex, if you were to suffer damage or injury to the primary motor cortex, if you were to suffer trauma or maybe a tumor growth on part of the primary motor cortex, what would it affect? What would be a result or indication of damage to the area? It could be what? Anyone? Paralysis, right? So if you suffer damage, for instance, right here to this area of the primary motor cortex, you could perhaps lose function and movement of part of your neck, or down here part of your arms, or even further part of your mouth. Okay, so the primary motor cortex is what allows and gives you control over your body movements, okay, your muscular movements and contractions. All right, now, do we have any other important areas here in the frontal lobe? So continue with the frontal lobe. Yes, we have, as you can see, many different areas. But if you were taking a nervous system or class just dedicated to the brain and nervous system, like neurology, then you would learn more detail. But I want to go, though, to this area way in the front of your frontal lobe. Okay, way in the front, the most anterior portion of your frontal lobe that you see colored here in pink. And that is called the prefrontal area or cortex. Okay, the prefrontal area or cortex. Now, what we find there in the prefrontal cortex is that we find there all of those roles and abilities that are associated with the higher mental ability functions, right? The higher mental functions, right? It's what makes the human brain unique. Okay? And so let me give you a list of some of the things associated with the prefrontal cortex. Okay? First of all, reasoning. Okay, reasoning is an important thing found here in the prefrontal cortex. Another, personality, intellect, okay, your mood, memory, planning, judgment, and motivation. These are all things that make the human brain unique from other animals, right? So most animals don't have that superior ability with many of these things that we mentioned, okay? But we do. We have personality and intellect. We have reasoning and mood, hopefully, okay? And judgment and so on, which is associated here in the prefrontal cortex, okay? So if a patient were to suffer a lobotomy of the prefrontal cortex, a lobotomy means removal, okay? Then what would happen is that person would lose many of these abilities, okay? Might also suffer conditions that affect mood and judgment and personality. Okay. Now, is lobotomy still done today? Yes, lobotomies are still done. However, they're done for treatment sometimes of a tumor or cancer. Do they still use it in mental institution facilities? Not as often, unless there is some type of condition affecting the brain, okay, such as a tumor. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at now. That was a couple of the important areas of the frontal lobe. So let me go back to my chapter again. Okay. And look for the colorful diagram that we had before. This one has a lot of detail, but let me just go back to this simple diagram once again, figure 1413. Now let's look at the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is the lobe that you have here where the areas are shaded in purple. Okay. Now the parietal lobe, if you look closely, okay, has an important gyrus there. The gyrus that you have right here that is dark purple is the gyrus or the elevation that's right posterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so therefore we name the gyrus the postcentral gyrus. Okay, the postcentral gyrus. So this is one important area here of the parietal lobe. Now the postcentral gyrus, this is actually, now I can show you with the other colorful diagram. So let me take a look at this figure 1420, and there you can see the postcentral gyrus is the location of my primary somatosensory cortex, the primary somatosensory area. Okay, what that area does is what? What does that area do? What does it provide? Anyone? It provides sensation, right? Perception. Perception. And here you can see the postcentral gyrus. Okay, and it provides sensation, perception of things being felt throughout the body, such as, for instance, at the top of the postcentral gyrus, somewhere here near the top, around here, you might feel things on your chest and abdomen. Maybe the hand is felt further down here. Things that you feel with your hands are felt in this area, right about here on the postcentral gyrus. So if I go back to this figure, hand sensation would be felt somewhere around this area of the postcentral gyrus. And so on and so on. So throughout the postcentral gyrus, which is my primary sensory cortex or primary somatosensory area, is where we allow to feel and perceive sensations throughout the body. Okay, now, right behind the primary somatosensory area is we have right here an association area for this, the somatosensory association area. So the primary area is this one, but the association area is right behind it. What does the association area do? Well, what this association area does is it allows you to make cognitive sense, make cognitive interpretation of what you are perceiving. So when you can touch things with your fingers, like here on this area, you feel things with your fingers. Let's say the texture of a cloth or silk or something rough on your table like sand. Okay, you can feel it. However, you make cognitive sense of it. You make cognitive interpretation through the association area. And the association area will then allow you to interpret that and say, it feels sort of smooth and soft, or it feels rough and like tiny granules, or it feels sharp and cold. So all those different interpretations of what you're sensing are permitted through this association area. Okay, so the association area actually gives you finer sense of what you're perceiving. Okay, that is a couple of the important things here for the parietal lobe. Let's now take a look at the next lobe down here. This next lobe. Okay. All right. What lobe was this? What I'm actually indicating with my pointer. What lobe is that? All right, good. That is the temporal lobe. Now, if you look at the temporal lobe, there are various regions. However, the one of greatest importance is this dark orange region right around here. This dark, not this orange region, but this sort of dark reddish shaded area right there. It says there the primary auditory cortex. The primary auditory cortex, which would be this area that I'm going to circle. Okay? All right, so the primary auditory cortex is in that superior area of the temporal lobe. And what it does is that it allows for what? For this, what sense does it allow for? The sense of hearing. Very good. Hearing. Okay, good. Hearing. Also, it does have some association with learning and memory. But a lot of learning and memory is distributed throughout various areas of the cerebrum as well. Not just there. But it is some association with learning and memory, which is definitely linked together with hearing. Now, does that mean people who are deaf cannot learn and memorize things? Of course not. But other areas of the brain will be greater involved in learning and memory in persons who have no hearing. But yes, a good part of learning things is listening. Don't they tell you that always? That your parents always tell you that? Listen to me so that you learn. Listen. And if you have good listening abilities, then you will learn things better as well. Anyway, so that is this lobe, the temporal lobe. Also, one other thing associated with the temporal lobe is on the medial surface. We don't see that. This is the lateral surface. This is the outer lateral surface of the temporal lobe. But if we took a view of the medial surface, let me see if I have a picture of the medial surface, meaning the inner surface of the temporal lobe, we would find there, let me see if I can use this one perhaps, somewhere here. So this is my temporal lobe. So we saw the outer surface out here, but if we looked on the inner surface, it's sort of hidden because we're not looking at the outer surface. I'm sorry, we're not looking at the inner surface with the other diagram. So be here on the medial view of the temporal lobe, we have a small area that's associated with the sense of smell. So the temporal lobe, and in fact, when we look at the nerves involved for smell, let me see if I can show that quickly. Okay, here is some of the nerves associated with some of the fine senses. Okay, and here you have the olfactory nerve for the sense of smell. The olfactory nerve then communicates to this medial surface of the temporal lobe, which is also shown here on the photograph. And there we have the area of the temporal lobe for the sense of smell. So the sense of smell is also found on the temporal lobe. However, on the outer surface that I showed you a moment ago is where we find the primary auditory area. Okay, so going back to this figure, the primary auditory cortex and the area for smell would be located underneath this. So I would have to lift this temporal lobe up. Let's take a look now at the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is back here. Okay, you can sort of see the line there that separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, and back here we have our occipital lobe. Now, one important area there on the occipital lobe is this area that you see there called the primary visual cortex. I don't think I need to tell you what the purpose of the primary visual cortex is, but its purpose is already defined with the word visual. This is the area that allows you to see, okay? So a person that has received trauma to this area, damage, a tumor, or whatever, often, many times, will lose their vision, okay? Can become blind. So, what sorts of trauma? Perhaps a person who fell on their back of their head and damaged this area seriously. So that's the primary visual cortex, which allows us to see, and that's found on the occipital lobe. Now, we do have one lobe left, and that's deep inside the cerebral hemisphere. So I would have to pull this lateral sulcus apart, pull it apart like I did with the dissection a few moments ago. And let me show you once again with the dissection. Where's that figure? Okay, and with the dissection, when I pull apart the lateral sulcus, you would find inside a lobe. Who remembers the name of the lobe that was in there? Right there? It's called the insula. Correct, the insula. Okay, now the insula is associated with what major function? What major function? It's with the function of the sense of taste. Correct, good. So taste. All right, so that's associated with the insular lobe or the insula. Okay, that covers our major lobes and some of their functions. Now, in a neurology class, in a neuroanatomy class specifically, you would learn a lot more and more specific details. Okay, what I've given you is some basic information here for the lobes and what you should review for the course. Now, one thing I do want to go over though is take a look at this figure here. Let's go back to the earlier figure from before, and we'll come back to these colorful diagrams. But if you remember, we saw here that we had two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, they look almost identical, really. In structure, they are the same. There's really no difference between them. However, functionally speaking, there are some very small and minor differences between the two hemispheres. Okay, now most of those basic functions that we described, like motor function, sensory, right? Hearing, smell, taste, and vision, and so forth, right, are associated with both hemispheres. But now let's take a look at some of the differences, though. Some of these few important differences between both hemispheres. Okay, now let's look at the right hemisphere first, the right cerebral hemisphere, which is this one on the diagram. Okay, now most of the images that show you a lateral view usually focus and show the left hemisphere, and you'll get that in a moment why. But in the right hemisphere, we do have some small and minor differences as well. So what we call this is the differences between both hemispheres in function is something that we call cerebral, let me type it down, cerebral lateralization. Cerebral lateralization, okay? Okay, so that refers to that the hemispheres differ in a few of their functions. They differ in a few of their functions. That means some of the functions are lateralized to one hemisphere or the other. Let's look at the right hemisphere first. Now, the right hemisphere is sometimes referred to or nicknamed as the representational hemisphere. That's the right hemisphere. So right here, let me draw a line here and just type in the right cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so the right one is sometimes referred to as the representational hemisphere. Okay, the reason is because this part of the brain, this part of the cerebrum, is associated with several important abilities, such as associated with greater imagination and insight. Okay, also with perception of patterns and spatial relationship. Okay? Now, think of these few words that I've used already. Imagination, spatial relationship, patterns, and so on. What are these abilities mostly associated with? What disciplines, what subjects that you take in school and in colleges are these different abilities mainly associated with?
Psychology.
Psychology, yes. Art, music. Okay, someone said creativity. What different disciplines do you use a lot of creativity? Art, music, literature, writing, and so forth. Many of those topics and disciplines and subjects that are often classified as being the humanities, right? Psychology as well. Okay. Now, someone mentioned thinking and intellect, reasoning. That is actually associated with both hemispheres. So both on the frontal lobes here and here, you have a lot of the thinking and and reasoning, judgment, and so forth. But these few things that I mentioned are more specific to the right hemisphere. Again, imagination, insight. Someone mentioned a great word, creativity, patterns and spatial relationship. And these things are more closely tied in with the music and the arts. And when you say arts, it doesn't just mean drawing and painting, but it also refers to writing and reading and poetry, even religion. Religion, which is part of insight, is mostly here on the right hemisphere. Now, let's take a look at the other cerebral hemisphere. Okay, the other cerebral hemisphere on this side is your left cerebral hemisphere. And okay, the left cerebral hemisphere. This one is okay, so I'll discuss this now. Okay, so the left cerebral hemisphere, this one is going to be the part of the brain which is greater associated with sequential and analytical reasoning. Sequential and analytical reasoning. Okay? So let me show you a better view of the left hemisphere. Most of the pictures you see left hemisphere, like here, here, here as well. Okay? So that is not because of these important abilities that I just mentioned, but it's because of something even more specific that we'll talk about in a moment. But one thing that's associated with the left cerebral hemisphere is the sequential and analytical reasoning. What disciplines and subjects are more closely related to sequential analytical reasoning? What subjects and disciplines? The disciplines and subjects that are today being described as being the STEM, right? STEM, which is science, technology, and math, right? Exactly. Math, science, technology. Okay? So that is something that is more associated here with the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay? Now, of course, on the left hemisphere, you also have these other things that we mentioned. But let me show you with this last diagram, 1420, and then we'll take a quick break. Here we see that we have here, again, in the left cerebral hemisphere is associated with math, science, analytical, and sequential reasoning. However, if you look closely here, we do have two other major areas here in the left hemisphere only in the left hemisphere. Two important areas. One is right here called Broca's area, and the other is called Wernicke's area. Okay, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is found right here, this small area, somewhere in the frontal lobe, right about here. And what that area does, Broca's area, which is only found in the left hemisphere, and that's why on purpose this diagram is left hemisphere, is that it allows for motor speech for conversation, for speaking, for chatting, for talking, right? Motor speech. Okay? So, if a person were to have a tumor growth here, or have a lobotomy and this area removed, that would affect greatly motor speech. In fact, person might not be able to speak at all, even though they have their vocal cords and their mouth intact. Everything is perfect for speaking, but if they lost that area, they could lose the ability to speak. Now, the other important area found here only in the left cerebral hemisphere is this area here that you see colored yellow. Okay? It's known as Wernicke's area. It might be pronounced differently in German. I believe it's probably German. It's Wernicke's area. Anyway, it's spelled with the W, and it's called Wernicke's area. And what that area does, it is only found in the left hemisphere, and it also does provide a specific role. Now, what it provides is that it is important for spoken and written language comprehension. Spoken and written language comprehension, meaning the ability to comprehend things that you read and things that are said to you, right? That are spoken to you in your own primary native language, at least in your own primary native language. Now, do persons who can speak more than one language or several languages have a greater developed Wernicke's area? I would expect so. However, everyone has to be able to communicate in one language, at least their native language, and that is because you have a Wernicke's area. Allows you to comprehend written and spoken language. A lot of the dysfunctions of speech, of understanding things that are said to people, have to do with these two areas. And there are disciplines in those areas that that students will enter that field, right? Anyone planning to go into speech therapy? Well, it has to do a lot with understanding these areas, okay? So you might discuss that again if you're going into speech therapy type of sciences. Okay, so that covers the cerebrum, the two cerebral hemispheres, and some of these important areas there on the cerebrum.